The scorching heat of July 15th, 1799 pressed down on French soldiers, strengthening Fort Julien near Rosetta in the Nile Delta. The air shimmered with dust and sweat as picks and shovels bit into ancient stones. Officer Pierre-François Bouchard supervised demolition work on an old wall when his men uncovered something extraordinary, a large dark stone covered in 3 different scripts. The top section showed Egyptian hieroglyphs, weathered but visible. Below was Demotic script, the cursive writing of everyday ancient Egypt. At the bottom were lines of ancient Greek text that Bouchard could actually read. This might be the same decree written in 3 languages, potentially the key to understanding hieroglyphs, those mysterious symbols that had puzzled scholars for over 1,000 years. The black granodiorite stone stood nearly 4 feet tall and weighed 3/4 of a ton. Despite damage to the top, the inscription remained largely intact. Bouchard immediately reported his find to General Jacques-François Menot, who recognized its potential importance. This discovery came during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, an ambitious expedition that was as much about knowledge as conquest. Napoleon had brought 167 scholars, scientists, and artists, men he called his donkeys, to study and document everything about Egypt. The Commission on the Sciences and Arts was already making remarkable discoveries throughout the land of the pharaohs. The French scholars immediately began copying and studying the inscription. They could read the Greek portion easily. It was a decree from 196 BCE by the priests of Memphis, honoring Pharaoh Ptolemy V on his coronation anniversary. But the real prize lay in the hieroglyphic and demotic sections above. If these contained the same text, they would provide the bilingual dictionary scholars had dreamed of for centuries. Word spread quickly through Europe's scholarly community, sparking intense interest among linguists and antiquarians. But the stone wouldn't remain in French hands long. Napoleon's dreams of Eastern Empire were crumbling, and with them, the fate of all treasures his expedition had discovered. By 1801, Napoleon's eastern dreams lay in ruins. Admiral Nelson had destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding the army in Egypt. British forces, allied with Ottoman troops, pressed the French from multiple directions. Facing inevitable defeat, General Menot was forced to negotiate surrender. The Treaty of Alexandria, signed in August 1801, contained a crucial clause. Article 16 specified that all natural and artificial curiosities collected by the French would be handed over to Britain. This included not just Rosetta Stone, but dozens of other artifacts that would form the foundation of the British Museum's Egyptian collection. The handover was dramatic. French scholars protested bitterly, arguing their research materials should be exempt. British General John Hely Hutchinson took a pragmatic approach. Scholars could keep their notes and drawings, but all original artifacts must be transferred to British custody. The scene at Alexandria was tense as French soldiers grudgingly loaded their archaeological treasures onto British ships. The stone arrived in Portsmouth in February 1802, accompanied by 15 other major Egyptian artifacts. It was immediately transported to London and placed in the British Museum on public display. Museum antiquarian Edward Clark wrote excitedly to a colleague, describing crowds of visitors pressing around the stone, trying to decipher its mysterious scripts. But the real work was just beginning. The British had won the stone, but they still had to crack its code. This task fell to some of the most brilliant minds of the age, men who would spend decades wrestling with the puzzle ancient Egypt had left behind. The first serious British attempt came from Thomas Young, a polymath whose interests ranged from medicine to physics to languages. Young was already famous for his wave theory of light, but he was equally fascinated by ancient scripts. In 1814, Young obtained high-quality copies of the inscription and began systematic analysis. Young's approach was methodical and scientific. He started with the assumption that the 3 texts were translations of each other, looking for patterns and correspondences. He had one crucial advantage. He could read the Greek text perfectly, giving him a template for understanding the other versions. Meanwhile, across the channel, young Jean-François Champollion was pursuing his own investigation. Champollion had been fascinated by ancient Egypt since childhood, teaching himself Coptic and immersing himself in every scrap of hieroglyphic information. The loss of the stone to Britain stung French pride, but motivated scholars to redouble their efforts. The stage was set for one of history's greatest intellectual competitions. On one side, methodical British scholarship embodied by Young. On the other, passionate French research represented by Champollion. Both men were brilliant, both determined, racing to solve the mystery that had eluded scholars for over a millennium. For over 1500 years, no one could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Philae. After that, the knowledge vanished, lost in the chaos of late antiquity. Yet hieroglyphs were everywhere in Egypt, decorating temple walls, tomb chambers, obelisks, and papyrus scrolls. European travelers had copied and published hieroglyphic inscriptions since the Renaissance, but they remained utterly incomprehensible. What made this loss particularly frustrating was that the symbols seemed to depict recognizable objects: birds, eyes, human figures, geometric shapes. But what did they mean? Earlier scholars developed elaborate theories, most completely wrong. The 17th century Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, perhaps the most famous early attempt, believed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, with each sign representing complex philosophical or religious concept. He produced translations that were complete fantasy, reading mystical meanings into what were actually mundane administrative records. This symbolic interpretation dominated European thinking for centuries. Most scholars assumed the ancient Egyptians had created an entirely pictorial writing system, where each symbol stood for an idea rather than a sound. Thomas Young brought fresh scientific perspective to this ancient puzzle. As a scientist, he was trained to look for patterns and test hypotheses systematically. Young began by carefully comparing the three Rosetta Stone texts, looking for correspondences between Greek and hieroglyphic versions. His first breakthrough came when he focused on the oval-shaped outlines in the hieroglyphic text. These cartouches seemed to enclose groups of hieroglyphic symbols. Young noticed exactly as many cartouches as there were mentions of royal names in the Greek version. This suggested cartouches marked royal names, a hypothesis that proved correct. Young's next insight was even more significant. By comparing cartouches with the Greek text, he identified which hieroglyphic symbols corresponded to Ptolemy. This was crucial because Ptolemy was a Greek name adapted into Egyptian writing. Young reasoned that foreign names might be written phonetically, that symbols might represent sounds rather than ideas. Working with this assumption, Young identified individual hieroglyphic signs corresponding to specific letters in Ptolemy's name. He matched the semicircle symbol with P, two diagonal lines with T, the lion with L. For the first time in over a millennium, someone was reading individual hieroglyphic symbols as phonetic signs. Young's work was groundbreaking, but limited. He correctly identified several phonetic signs and established that cartouches contained royal names, but he still believed most hieroglyphs were symbolic rather than phonetic. He thought ancient Egyptians used alphabetic signs only for foreign words, while keeping their traditional symbolic system for native Egyptian terms. Young published his findings in 1819, causing sensation and intense debate. Some scholars praised his methodical approach and significant discoveries. Others criticized his methods or challenged his conclusions. In France, one young scholar read Young's work with particular interest, recognizing both its brilliance and limitations. Jean-François Champollion was about to build on Young's foundation to achieve the breakthrough that would finally crack ancient Egypt's code. Jean-François Champollion was born in 1790 in the small French town of Figeac, and from childhood seemed destined for scholarly greatness. By 16, he was already fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Sanskrit, and Coptic. His fascination with ancient Egypt began early, sparked by conversations with Jean-Baptiste Fourier, a mathematician who had participated in Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, and regaled young Champollion with tales of hieroglyphic mysteries. Unlike Thomas Young, who approached hieroglyphs as an intellectual puzzle to be solved through systematic analysis, Champollion brought intuitive understanding of how languages actually function. His mastery of Coptic was particularly crucial. This was the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, written in Greek letters, but preserving many features of the Pharaonic tongue. Champollion understood that if he could crack the hieroglyphic code, he would essentially be reading the ancestor of Coptic. Champollion had been working on hieroglyphs since 1808, long before he had access to Young's publications. When Young's work appeared in 1819, Champollion studied it carefully, recognizing the Englishman's important contributions while seeing where he could push further. Young had established that some hieroglyphs were phonetic, and cartouches contained royal names, but Champollion suspected the phonetic principle extended far beyond just foreign words. The breakthrough came in September 1822, when Champollion was working with copies of hieroglyphic inscriptions from the temple of Abu Simbel. These inscriptions contained cartouches with names not mentioned on the Rosetta Stone, forcing Champollion to develop new methods for decipherment. He had already worked out the hieroglyphic spelling of Ptolemy from Young's research and identified Cleopatra's name from inscriptions on the Philly obelisk, providing crucial cross-checks for his phonetic readings. But the Abu Simbel inscriptions contained much older names, pharaohs from Egypt's imperial age, long before the Greek period. One cartouche particularly intrigued him. It began with a symbol of the sun disk, which he knew was pronounced Ra in Coptic. The cartouche ended with a double S sound that he had identified from other inscriptions. In the middle were symbols that, if his phonetic theory was correct, should spell out a mess. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. Ra-MSS, Rameses, the great pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. Champollion realized the implications immediately. If this cartouche really spelled Rameses, then hieroglyphs weren't just phonetic for foreign names. They were phonetic for Egyptian names too. And if they were phonetic for names, why not for other words as well? Working feverishly, Champollion tested his theory on another cartouche from the same inscription. This one began with an ibis, the sacred bird of the god Thoth. In Egyptian mythology, Thoth was called Jehuti. Could this cartouche spell out that name? Working through the signs, Champollion found it indeed spelled Thutmose, the Hellenized version of an Egyptian pharaoh's name, meaning Thoth is born. He had not just identified a few more royal names, he had proven that the entire hieroglyphic system was fundamentally phonetic. The ancient Egyptians had created not a mystical symbolic language, but a sophisticated writing system that combined phonetic signs, meaning signs, and grammatical markers in complex but logical ways. On September 14, 1822, Champollion burst into his brother Jacques Joseph's office, waving his notes and gasping, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," before collapsing from excitement. He had solved a mystery that had puzzled humanity for more than a millennium, but Champollion was too careful a scholar to let enthusiasm override caution. Over the following weeks, he tested his discoveries against every hieroglyphic text he could find, refining his understanding and building systematic knowledge of how the writing system worked. He discovered that hieroglyphs combined multiple functions. Some signs represented sounds, others represented meaning, and still others served as grammatical markers or determinatives that clarified the meaning of preceding signs. On September 27, 1822, just 13 days after his breakthrough, Champollion presented his findings to the French Academy in a paper titled Letter to Monsieur Dacier on the alphabet of the phonetic hieroglyphs. The presentation caused a sensation. For the first time since late antiquity, someone could actually read the words that the pharaohs had carved in stone. The impact of Champollion's breakthrough was immediate and profound. Within months of his presentation to the French Academy, scholars across Europe were applying his methods to hieroglyphic texts that had been mute for centuries. Ancient Egypt, which had existed in European imagination as a land of mysterious symbols and incomprehensible wisdom, suddenly became accessible to historical study. Champollion himself led the way in exploiting his discovery. In 1824, he published his Précis of the Hieroglyphic System, which laid out the complete principles of Egyptian writing. He showed that hieroglyphs combined three types of signs: phonetic symbols representing sounds, ideographic symbols representing meaning, and determinative symbols that clarified the category of the preceding word. This complex but logical system allowed ancient Egyptians to write everything from religious poetry to administrative records, from love songs to medical texts. The decipherment opened floodgates of new knowledge about ancient Egyptian civilization. Suddenly, scholars could read the autobiographies that nobles had carved on their tomb walls, learning about their careers, families, and beliefs about the afterlife. They could study religious texts covering temple walls, gaining insights into Egyptian theology and ritual practice. Administrative documents revealed the workings of pharaonic government, while literary texts showed the sophistication of Egyptian poetry and storytelling. Perhaps most significantly, hieroglyphic decipherment allowed scholars to read Egyptian historical records directly, rather than relying on Greek and Roman accounts. King lists carved in temples provided new chronological frameworks. Royal inscriptions revealed the pharaoh's own accounts of their military campaigns and building projects. For the first time, ancient Egypt could speak in its own voice. The discovery sparked a golden age of Egyptian archaeology. Knowing they could now read whatever inscriptions they found, archaeologists launched ambitious expeditions to sites throughout Egypt and Sudan. Giovanni Belzoni explored the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings. Auguste Mariette founded the Egyptian Antiquities Service and discovered the Serapeum at Saqqara. Later, Howard Carter would use hieroglyphic clues to locate and excavate Tutankhamun's tomb. Champollion himself made one triumphant journey to Egypt in 1828 to 1829, the only time he would see the land of the pharaohs with his own eyes. Traveling up the Nile with a small team of scholars, he verified his decipherments against original monuments and made new discoveries daily. His notebooks from this journey record his wonder at finally reading inscriptions he had studied for so long in European libraries. "The inscriptions are absolutely conformable to my system," he wrote to his brother. "Everything confirms it beyond the shadow of a doubt." Tragically, Champollion died in 1832 at age 41, only 10 years after his great breakthrough. But his work had already transformed Egyptology from amateur enthusiasm into rigorous academic discipline. His students and followers continued developing his methods, gradually working out more complex aspects of Egyptian grammar and expanding the dictionary of known hieroglyphic words. The Rosetta Stone itself became one of the world's most famous objects, a symbol of human curiosity and scholarly achievement. It remains the most visited object in the British Museum, seen by millions each year, but it also became a symbol of cultural controversy. In recent decades, Egyptian officials have called for the stone's return, arguing it was taken during the colonial period and should be repatriated to its country of origin. Modern technology has made the Rosetta Stone more accessible than ever. High-resolution digital images allow scholars worldwide to study every detail without traveling to London. 3D scanning has created precise replicas for museums around the world. Online databases provide instant access to thousands of hieroglyphic texts with translations and grammatical analyses that would have amazed Champollion. Yet for all our technological advances, the fundamental principles Champollion discovered in 1822 remain the foundation of hieroglyphic studies. Every Egyptologist today builds on his breakthrough, using methods he pioneered to read texts that continue expanding our understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. Today, facing our own mysteries and challenges, the Rosetta Stone offers inspiration. It shows us that even the most intractable puzzles can be solved through patience, systematic study, and willingness to challenge established assumptions. Champollion succeeded not just because of his brilliance, but because he combined rigorous scholarship with imaginative leaps, methodical analysis with intuitive insight,